Perfect. Okay, so our Capstone project is looking at the social and environmental implications of Newark's flood water crisis. I'm personally joined by Adalia and Paula. We're going to start by maybe giving a little roadmap of what we'll be talking about today. So we're going to go over our project objectives, give some background on Newark in general, and then dive into the specifics of the Newark water crisis, including a brief timeline. After that, we'll talk about our research methods and stakeholders, followed by a discussion on our deliverables, which include a program review for how the city of Newark has handled the water crisis, and a resource hub for lead in drinking water. And lastly, we will discuss our conclusions and how this project connects to larger topics such as the Sustainable Development Goals and water being a fundamental human right. So getting into our project objectives, we've spent the past year trying to understand the complexity of the Newark water crisis. We will get into the timeline a little bit later, but the general gist is that Newark, since at least 2017, has exceeded the federal action level for lead in their drinking water for at least 6 consecutive 6-month periods. So basically, Newark's water has been unsafe to drink since 2017. And there has been this whole long tail of government denial, government avoidance, historical disinvestment, and environmental racism, all coming together to impact the community of Newark. We really wanted to understand the crisis from as many angles as possible. So looking at historical and socioeconomic and geographical background of Newark, we have been using an environmental justice framework to understand the problem and then to find key stakeholders to sort of help us give voice to the crisis, with our major objective being to have a comprehensive understanding of the problem. Our next objective was to look critically at how the city of Newark has responded to this crisis and how that response can or could have been improved. We also wanted to understand how lead contamination can be avoided or minimized in other cities across the US, and so that became another one of our objectives.
So just an overview here. Lead is a toxic metal, and if it accumulates in the body, can have serious health effects, especially for children. It is not visible to the human eye, as it does not change color or odor of water. And before it was banned in the US, lead was used in a number of products, including paint, gasoline, household fixtures. And although it was banned, homes built before 1978 may still contain fixtures and pipes with lead. And much of our water infrastructure in the US, particularly in older cities, contains lead that carry water into our homes. The lead can enter drinking water if water has high acidity or a low mineral count. Water treatment systems are responsible for treating the water with anti-corrosion chemicals to prevent the lead from leaching into the drinking water. And in drinking water, the most common sources are lead pipes, as well as faucets and fixtures. But a significant source also comes from the lead service lines, which are the pipes that connect the home from the water main. An EPA has established a lead and copper rule in 1991 with subsequent revisions to protect the health and reduce exposure to lead in drinking water. The Safe Water Drinking Act requires that the EPA establish a treatment technique to check if the corrosion is working. EPA requires a water system test for the lead at tap in certain homes. The limit is 15 parts per billion, but if 10% of the sample exceed this limit, the system must take action in including line pipe replacement. And this year, the lead and copper rule is proposing some changes to modify the action level from 15 to 10 parts per billion. Next.
Now that Idalia gave a brief overview about lead drinking water, I'm going to provide a general overview of Newark. So Newark is the largest city in the state of New Jersey, located in the northeastern region of the state. The accessible location has made this city one of the most important in the country. And the map that you can see on the right shows the internal division of Newark into 5 wards. So the Newark has a population of 282,000 inhabitants, with a distribution of ethnic groups that you can see color code in this map. Almost 50% are African Americans, followed by Hispanics, and the median annual income is about 35,000, which is below the national average, and the poverty rate is 28%. Historically, the city has a major industrial hub with the highest industrial level by 1950 and a population of 500,000. But commerce and manufacturing declined and the population was reduced by 50% in 2000.
Okay, so getting into the timeline of the Newark water crisis a little bit here. We have all of the major events that have happened in Newark since 2017. The yellow circles on the screen represent the federal action level exceedances that Newark saw, and the purple triangles represent government interventions. So you can see that the city took a while to begin intervening through different solutions, and that these interventions were also sporadically applied throughout the ongoing crisis. So for some clarity, the problem began because the city had changed the acidity of the water treatment process, which made the water more corrosive. That, along with historical disinvestment in infrastructure, meant that the more corrosive water began attacking these aging pipes, causing the lead to leach into the water. So Newark officially started monitoring for lead in 6-month time chunks in 2017 after lead was found in multiple schools across the city. June 2017 saw the first exceedance of the federal action level for lead, which, like has been mentioned, is 15 parts per billion, but this number is semi-arbitrary as there is no real safe level for lead in humans. So from there, we see advocacy groups begin the process of prodding the city to take action, and multiple additional exceedances by the city. Finally, in 2018, Newark begins offering water filters to its residents, but this program was very exclusionary and filters were difficult to install and not necessarily effective. We see more exceedances and the city's announcement to begin replacing lead service lines and providing bottled water, but again, only to certain residents. In June 2020, Newark announced the first 6-month period that they didn't exceed the federal action limit, but this was contested by the National Resource Defense Council, who reported that they did in fact exceed that federal action limit again. And then this was then confirmed by the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection in December 2020. So as of January 2021, Newark had reported 16,000 lead service lines replaced, and a settlement was reached in the federal water case that city advocates had brought against Newark. So now we will get into the lead contamination details a bit more.
Now I'm going to give you main points of lead contamination in Newark during the crisis time. So Newark has 2 water distribution systems. One is Piconut and the other one is Wanake. The corrosion control treatment for Piconut based on sodium silicate didn't work, and lead contamination was extensive since 2017. The Wanake system uses orthophosphate and has shown less lead contamination, but sometimes exceeding the limit of 15 parts per billion. In 2019, there were increased levels of lead in the Piconut system. As you can see, the red marks in the map that exceeded 50 parts per billion. But you know that there is not safe lead limit. The failure is the inadequate water treatment for the troubled Piconut plant, corroding the lead service lines and dissolving lead particles into the drinking water. The data for 2019 shows that 10% of newer water exceeded 67 parts per billion, making more than almost 4 times the federal limit. And some homes reported levels between 200 and 900 parts per billion. Newark water's lead level are among the highest of any water system serving more than 100,000 people in the country, and far exceeds those in cities facing lead contamination of water.
As part of our research methods, our focus was defined around an environmental justice framework. So we begin with a look and focus on race and class and how it aligns with environmental justice. This critical analysis also includes looking at the current representation of the problem and who has the power to define the problem and represent the dominant narrative. We collected data from media sources, from consultants, community organizations, as well as official government documents to understand the problem and what has happened, which leads us to speaking to stakeholders. It was important to us to try to speak to as many stakeholders as we can from as many perspectives as possible. So we spoke to many people via semi-structured interviews that allowed us to get the perspective of the interviewee. After conducting the interviews, we could look at the narrative around the crisis parallel to the public narratives that have become the dominant narratives and evaluate what it might leave out. We were able to use the information from our interviews as well as data collected and a number of our sources to look at other narratives. Lastly, we take multiple information sources to triangulate and conduct our overall program evaluation. Next.
Yeah, so taking just a little bit of a deeper look at our stakeholders, we went through and identified 5 types of possible stakeholders that we were going to be interviewing. So within each of those 5 types, we made lists of possible contacts and then reached out to those individuals and had interviews like Adalia mentioned. We were actually able to speak with research and academic experts, some community organizations and advocates, and some key community members. We weren't actually able to speak with or get a hold of any of the corporate or business insiders like CDM Smith, who is the firm responsible for the lead service line replacement, or really any government officials, although we did review official city press releases and went to a virtual town meeting to sort of understand where the city was at with the Newark water crisis.
After our initial research, data collection, and stakeholder interviews, we identified 3 key findings as needs or priorities that became the focus as part of our deliverables, our program overview and resource hub, which we'll talk about as well. So our deliverables have a specific emphasis on empowerment of the community and encouraging involvement in trying to eliminate barriers to transparency, oversight, a proactive and preventative approach, and creating more accountability and protocols to help deliver the things that the policies are intended to do. So this is our way of addressing some of the needs we saw in our background research. Next.
So diving into our program review, we identified about 4 different areas of evaluation for the city of Newark's response to the water crisis. The first that we looked at is this idea of historical disinvestment in both water infrastructure and the water department as a whole. This is a pretty similar story that we saw across the rest of the country, where we see a resistance to putting funding towards infrastructure projects to both upgrade and maintain these systems. Because of this, water systems are aging and more susceptible to corrosion, especially when paired with changes to water chemistry like we saw with Newark. The American Society of Civil Engineers actually releases infrastructure report cards for the country and individual states. Both the US and New Jersey recently received scores of D+ for their water infrastructure. This low grade likely comes from this disinvestment in infrastructure over time, as well as limited resources within the city's budget, and the fact that policymakers who control these budgets are not necessarily the people who are administering or managing the water system. And lastly, another kind of disinvestment is this idea of brain drain, where technical knowledge within the actual water department either doesn't get passed down to new people and gets lost, or individuals are pulled away from the city for opportunities elsewhere that may have more or better resources.
Now, I'm going to describe how the city responds for monitoring in the city. So Newark is a large water system requiring 100 samples semi-annually, but allowing to discard 50%. But until 2015, Newark collected only a few samples every 3 years, and mostly from the same selected size. So this lack of sampling policy was ineffective to defeat lead concentration and prompt a remedial action. During 2017 to 2019, the lead concentration exceeded the limit lead level of 15 parts per billion. And you can see the table above shows the 19 percentile values. So the data for 2020 was disputed by NRDC because the sampling procedure were biased and selectively targeting sites with historical low concentration and not following standard procedures. There was an apparent intent by the city to misrepresent or deny the problem and manipulate the data to show favorable results. There was an apparent intent by the city to misrepresent. Sorry. They also collect some limited sequential samples from homes and running water from different intervals. And the result for Piconet showed that lead contamination is not limited to the service lines and home fixtures, but include the main line as well. So there seems to be an effort to incorrectly argue that the problem is within the homes and not in the system, but not supported by experts and advocacy groups. So according, now I'm going to describe briefly the lead water sampling procedures that according to the EPA, the sampling that the homes consists of first draw by collecting the 1 liter after 6 or more hours of examination, which is taken by the homeowner. This limit sample includes only water that is close to the faucet. To better capture the lead content, the city also collected limited sequential sampling by samples of half of liter for up to 10 liters. The objective was to include testing water within the property and also the main pipe. The result from Piconet showed that lead contamination existed also in the water distribution system outside the home. So in the following slide, you will see the maps within the water crisis. So now this is the sequence. So the maps above, you can see the increase of sampling from 2017 to 2020 as the lead contamination issue became more public year by year. Most of the sites are from Piconot, which had the highest contamination affecting mostly African American and Hispanic communities. The sampling was biased by testing selective sites rather than including all of the neighborhoods. There were problems with lead sampling, such as homeowner error due to improper training and procedure. The city didn't keep accurate records of sampling sites. Lack of balance of testing sites from Piconet and Newark. And more importantly, oversampling of selected sites with historically low concentrations that perhaps as an attempt to mislead and ignore the problem. Next.
So we also reviewed the city's communication strategy, and some of our key findings are summarized in this chart. The city has made efforts to improve transparency. They've done things like roll out a website in which residents can check the status of their address and see if their lead service lines have been replaced or when they are scheduled to be replaced. However, the challenges we see in some of these different communication strategy is that community pressure or even a lawsuit was required for the city to begin implementing a strategy. Initial communications were oversimplified or denied the problem completely to a certain point. And after community pressure is when we see several measures are taken into account. The city even hired a public relations firm to navigate negative media and public mistrust. So, and one major area where we see little shift is in the response over time in making public health as a priority in the discussion. Very little exists beyond the general information that's required to be shared. There are links and resources where people can find information about testing for lead blood levels, but a public health program can go beyond this. Next.
We also see the city trying to frame the water crisis as a purely technical problem. This is an issue for many reasons. The first being that a technical problem likely requires a purely technical solution, which limits community involvement, engagement, and advocacy. Specifically with the lead service line replacement that we're seeing in Newark, the community was not necessarily consulted about this, which left gaps in knowledge about when and where the pipe replacement was most needed. It also loses sight of the problem as a whole and whittles it down to like this one thing that the city can look back on as an accomplishment. By framing the water crisis as a technical problem, it ignores the environmental racism and inequity issues that we've seen throughout studying this problem. And lastly, and probably most importantly, and mostly informed by the last 2 points, it doesn't provide the city with any accountability to review other possible sources of lead contamination, including fixtures in the homes of individuals or any water treatment errors that may still be happening at like the water treatment plants or additional sources of lead.
After this, we made an analysis of the city response by looking at the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. So here are some highlights. One, with the strengths, obtain financial resources to take care of the problem, leading to lead service line replacement within 2 years. Implemented a modified water treatment for Piconot similar to more successfully full treatment for Guanaque, and create a tracking system and share information with public. Weaknesses, slow response, neglect, and band-aid solutions, such as inadequate water treatment, poor distribution, and lack of training of water filters. Another one is lack of monitoring, manipulating the data, and sampling, and lack of resources for public health. In opportunities is increased transparency and participation for residents and community organizations, pass legislation to protect the health of minority communities, and establish an inspection for lead and aspartas cells of homes, similar to the asbestos. And the last one, that is threats. One is compliance with higher federal standards, and the other one is lack of policy for inspecting and replacing lead fixtures and components at home.
So in our conclusions, we touch on a few things as part of our overall program analysis, including the shortcomings in the sampling and monitoring procedures, and procedures should be science-based. Recently, the EPA published proposed lead and copper rule revisions. So of course those should be followed, but they should go beyond the minimum requirements and should also be proportionately representative across the city. The pervasiveness and the depth of the contamination problem was seen as the sampling procedures were increased. And while the official crisis began in 2017 when it garnered public attention, historical documents show that this problem was culminating years before. And the lack of attention goes back to the disinvestment and failure to properly monitor and maintain, as well as the lack of political commitment to protecting drinking water. And I would just add that just a few weeks ago, the Senate passed a $35 billion bipartisan bill So that's a step in the right direction for funding that supports programs for safe drinking water. And it amends the Safe Drinking Water Act to provide assistance and reduce lead, and provides assistance to communities prioritizing small and disadvantaged communities who may not have the resources. However, in our review, we note that the technical framing of the problem does not address the deeper issues. And lastly, the mobilization of the community and advocacy groups represents the value of community involvement. The city takes a sort of a bureaucratic kind of traditional approach, but there is an opportunity to improve and build on it with the community involvement and potentially community oversight. So the community helped to supplement many of the solutions that the city did implement, and access to knowledge and information that the community brings is also valuable, especially on the ground implementation. So we believe that working side by side with the community is essential to creating solutions and long-term approaches. From a traditional policymaking perspective, solutions offered can often be more technical. It offers a top-down approach that relies on following the bureaucratic systems and following EPA guidelines, but they're still reactive. For the community, the objectives might differ and the goals may be going beyond the federal standards. For instance, with more proactive standards and inputs, action levels may have actually been at earlier points in the current exceedance. So governance is important, and rather than from a traditional perspective, in which water distribution is not primarily just a matter of technical infrastructure, community-based involvement and oversight can offer approaches that best serve the system and the community, and new approaches to government in which the community can participate in all aspects of water infrastructure and monitoring, and even in helping more effectively implement solutions for any potential problems that may arise. So through active communication between the city and residents and community representatives that can be involved in decision making. So not entirely change the system, but build on it and value the knowledge and inputs of the community, and strengthen trust and collaboration to empower residents. Next.
Okay, so following this program review, and again, emphasizing sort of how much Newark has said that they want to be a leader and example in their handling of the lead water crisis, we wanted to be able to sort of take a lessons learned approach and see how it would apply to other cities. From our research and the interviews that we did, we heard many people discuss how this is not just a Newark problem, but a national one. The graphs here show highlighted counties who had at least one community water system with a federal action level exceedance for lead from January 2015 to December 2019. These purple blocks represent almost 5.5 million Americans and over 50,000 water systems. So it's very clear that lead in drinking water will continue to be an issue communities face. With that being said, we wanted to incorporate what we saw in Newark into some kind of informational hub that can be shared with other communities and used by the community of Newark. So we created a website or resource hub that is focused on lead in drinking water from an environmental justice lens. The site has multiple features, including links to resources and case studies, as well as a map that individuals can click on to be taken directly to the department that manages their safe drinking water resources. The resource hub has 4 main tabs that are broken down by what we thought would be most helpful to community members or organizers in similar situations. The first tab being governance. It can be highly confusing to identify where drinking water regulations live within each city's governance system. Some of these can be found in health departments, others in environmental protection departments, and sometimes a mix of both. And so we have that information here. We also have information on the rules and laws governing drinking water, like the Safe Drinking Water Act and the Lead and Copper Rule. We also included information on water testing resources and how to request information from government using the Freedom of Information Act. Our next section is public health, which includes health impacts and symptoms from lead and information on public health data and monitoring. We also included a section on environmental aspects like environmental racism, water being a human right, and plastic pollution. And lastly, we included a section for advocacy where people can go to find organizing resources and ways to mobilize their community, and case studies as well as support structures that already exist to help people like the National Resource Defense Council.
So our project ties to the shown UN Sustainable Development Goals, particularly clean water and sanitation and reduced inequalities. Our overall program review suggests that the current strategies are not sustainable long-term approaches, that lead water crises are a social justice issue, and communities should be meaningfully involved in managing water distribution systems. And that's it.
Thank you.